speaking with Mr. Jiti Ogunye, who is in our Lagos studio. A very disturbing video that we showed earlier. Thank you so much indeed, Mr. Ogunye, for joining us tonight on the program. The pictures coming out of the court, the premises of the Federal High Court in Ikoyi. Perhaps as a lawyer, you might be able to describe to us what is happening. For a fact, this is what we know, Mr. Ogunye, that Mr. Godwin Emefiele had been admitted to bail and the sum of 20 million naira. Fact one. Fact two, that the court ruled that he be remanded at the correctional center pending the fulfillment of the bail condition. Fact three, that the DSS has now rearrested him. Those are what we know for now. In the beginning, let's start by asking you, Mr. Ogunye, what happened on the premises of the court, the fisticuff between the DSS operative and the correctional facility operative? How would you describe it?
Well, thanks, Jim, for inviting me. As a Nigerian, not just as a lawyer, I found what happened in court today very outrageous and indefensible, in the sense that that act affronts our sense of decency. It affronts our sense of what is basic and what is acceptable, you know, in the court of law and its presence. Yes, I know that, you know, forever and ever we've been talking about interagency relationship, not just cooperation amongst security agencies in Nigeria and how they, you know, treat one another, with some of them thinking that they were senior partners. We've seen since 1999 many fights between the military and the police. We witnessed the Ojuelegba barrack incineration or arson by soldiers who invaded the place at that time during the Obasanjo administration. And we've seen many occurrences like that. As a matter of fact, regarding the person in question, Emefiele, we saw that before the Buhari administration packed up, that the same DSS withdrew their security detail from Emefiele because it was obvious they wanted to arrest him. They went to court, saw the leave of the court, denied to arrest him, and soldiers were the persons who started, you know, guarding Emefiele in the last days of the Buhari administration. Such dysfunctionality. So we've seen all these things happen. But one had hoped that so early in the day, this kind of thing will not, you know, repeat itself. So it's unacceptable. And so going back to the facts that are available, Emefiele was arrested. It was obvious that the DSS didn't want to release him. His lawyers went to court to force the hands of the DSS. And eventually, the DSS announced that they were going to comply with the order of the court by arraigning him in court. And so they brought him to Lagos from Abuja. And the court granted him bail because he was charged with the offense of illegal possession of firearms, which is a federal offense, and that's why he was taken to the Federal High Court in Lagos, because the search of his house or premises was conducted in Lagos, and so obviously it's the court in Lagos that has jurisdiction. But I haven't charged him to court, and the court haven't granted him bail on the fact one, and the court haven't ordered that he be remanded in Ikoyi prisons, pending the time he will perfect his bail conditions. Ordinarily, what should have followed was that the correctional service will take custody of him because there will have been a remand or detention warrant issued by the court directed to the Deputy Comptroller of Prison, Ikoyi Prison, to take custody of the person of Emefiele and not to the DSS. So there shouldn't have been any reason, therefore, for the DSS to intervene at that point to effect his arrest. Even if the DSS had a reason, a reasonable ground or a pretext for rearresting him in connection with other offenses that we may not know, and they've not made any disclosure to this effect. They've not told us that they had another court to arrest him and put him in detention. The DSS attorneys, the federal government attorneys, should have informed the court while that bail was being considered that, my lord, look, we've arraigned him and he's been granted bail. However, we have another reason, or we have another order from another court to arrest him immediately after his arraignment. And the court will have listened to that, and perhaps the court will have said, okay, if that's the case, I better remand him in your custody pending the time to fulfill that bail conditions. I know as a fact that by practice, arresting agencies, when they arraign criminal defendant, particularly for economic and financial crimes, with the EFCC, for example, some persons that are arraigned criminal defendants and the attorney will say, no, don't remand me in prison custody because the place is hostile. Remand me in EFCC custody in Ikoyi, which is the highbrow, Milverton part of Lagos, and until I fulfill my bail conditions. You recall that some politicians who are arrested in will say, we prefer to be detained in EFCC custody. And such occasion, EFCC will say, look, prison or our detention facility is stretched. No, remand them in prison custody and we don't need them anymore. So even if the DSS had wanted him to be retained in their custody pending the fulfillment of his bail conditions, they should have informed the court. There is no reason whatsoever.
Mr. Ogunye, let's look at it. Look, I'm looking at the implication now of what has happened. I thank you for explaining the circumstances and some of the procedures around what could have happened today. But let's look at the rule of law, where all the operatives and every person in Nigeria should operate under. The law is above everyone. No one should be above the law. Let's look at, could there be an injury done to the judiciary today? Is there an injury to our democracy? Is the DSS playing far above the rule of law? Did they show any kind of conduct of decorum within the court premises? Was there some kind of denigration of the temple of justice today? What is the implication of that fisticuff that we saw at the premises of the court today?
Look, it takes two to tango. It's not just the DSS. And I think that we can deprecate what the DSS has done, and it has implication for the integrity of the judiciary. That kind of unruly behavior and wielding of guns ought not to have occurred in that court. As a matter of fact, it's proverbial for me that while Emefiele was accused of perhaps being a gun runner or perhaps being in legal possession of firearms, it was the DSS today that was openly and brazenly displaying guns within a civil court, in a court premises. That ought not to have happened. And so I deprecate that kind of conduct. However, for the prison authorities, I don't think that the prison authority ought to have engaged the DSS in a fisticuff, even if the DSS was illegally arresting, if that was what it was, because there will always be a recourse. The prison authorities are not the defendants of the court or the enforcers of the court's order in that respect. If the DSS operatives willfully claiming to be operating under higher authorities defy the court, disobey the court in quick time, there and then, the prison authorities have no need to prove. They ought to have just allowed the DSS to carry on with what they're doing, and then the lawyers will have recourse by going back to the court to say, look, this is what happened, and the court will then protect its own integrity by then reiterating his order and ensuring that his order is obeyed. So it takes two to tango, and I'm not deprecating the DSS operatives alone, but the prison officials who were engaging them and then close to our turn and so on and so forth. Overall, My view is that that kind of thing ought not to have occurred today. There was no reason for it. The criminal defendant was not going to be stolen from prison. Is not going to be stolen from the DSS custody. So they ought to have de-escalated both sides. And I don't think that what they did today was correct.
To close this conversation, and in just about 20 seconds, because I'm being told I'm totally out of time, from which quarters do you think an intervention could come on this kind of scenario? In 20 seconds.
Well, the lawyers can trigger, Emefiele lawyer can trigger something by going back to that court to say, look, this is unacceptable. A court of law had granted an order, and that order ought to have been disobeyed. And if there's any pretext or ground or reason for engaging in that kind of conduct, it will now be the DSS to come out, the duty to come out and tell the court why they engage in that kind of conduct. We don't have an attorney general yet that could have come because it's the office of the attorney general that was prosecuting. So I assume that will have been held to account for this kind of conduct. But the conduct, for me, was totally unacceptable. And he then suggests, which is my last line, that perhaps the rule of force is predominant over the rule of law. That ought not to be so. That brandishing of guns and weapons in court, in civil court, where a judge sits or where there are many judges in that court, ought not to have been allowed, ought not to have occurred at all. And so it was a sheer display of bravado and, rule of force, which ought not to have occurred in any circumstances.
A very senior lawyer, Mr. Jiti Ogunye, thank you so much for your intervention and the perspectives that you're giving on this matter. Some of those things that gives some of us some kind of jitter in our veins when we see a democracy is being poked in the eye and there is a threat on our society. Whoever the case is concerned, our courts should not be denigrated. Thank you so much, Mr. Ogunye, for your time tonight. That's all.